Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, on Wednesday, Chancellor Osborne will announce the government's spending plans for this Parliament. Over the next 5 years, they will total £4 trillion. But even to stay within that barely imaginable sum of money, Mr Osborne will have to continue to cut departmental and welfare spending. Hence the mantra you hear a lot of this week, quote, a country that lives within its means. In other words, more of a squeeze on many public services. The Chancellor wants government departments to find a further £20 billion worth of savings between now and 2020. So where could that money come from? Joko has been taking a look.
Welcome to our virtual Treasury courtyard. Now, they don't have one of these in the real courtyard, but it represents everything the government is due to spend this year, which adds up to £742 billion. And I'm going to start by highlighting a few of the most significant parts of this total annual budget. You can see the £217 billion that goes on social security. That includes everything from job seekers' allowance to the state pension. And there's the £35 billion the UK is due to spend this year in interest on its debt. And George Osborne says that's a figure he's determined to bring down. Now, the focus of his statement is the money that goes on administering and delivering public services, departmental spending. Here it is, and you can see it's just under half of the total the government spends. Now, we're going to delve into the budgets of a few of the most substantial government departments. Let's start with health, because it's the NHS that accounts for the biggest chunk of this kind of spending. Now, the Chancellor isn't going to find any of his savings here because he's promised to increase NHS funding in England by £10 billion by the next election. The government's also promised a real terms increase in the defence budget every year. That's part of its commitment to meeting the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defence of the realm. The government's also committed to spending 0.7% of GDP on overseas aid, meaning that budget is also protected. So the Chancellor's not going to find any of his £20 billion worth of savings he says he needs to make from either health, defence or aid. So where could it come from instead? Well, what about from the education budget, which is a big part of what the state spends on public services? Well, here the Conservatives have promised a cash increase per pupil in schools. That means savings from here will be limited, although the rest of the budget doesn't have any guaranteed protection. Here's the money that goes to English local authorities. This was one of the first departments to agree to big savings in advance of the statement. Let's look now at the Home Office, whose budget this year is £10.6 billion. And the single biggest thing Theresa May's department spends money on is the grant it gives to police forces in England and Wales. Although they also get some of their money from other sources, including your local council tax bill. And some of the other departments that are going to have to find big savings over the next 4 years are the departments of business, transport and justice. But let's go back now to that big part of government spending I mentioned earlier. Social security. Because, of course, that's where a lot of the focus has been in the weeks and months before this statement. Now, again here, there's plenty the Chancellor won't touch. The state pension is a massive part of the budget. But the government has a long-standing promise not to cut it, along with various pensioner benefits. The other areas of big spending the government has had to look to are housing benefit, disability benefits and incapacity benefits. And you can see that big sum of money, £30 billion, that's due to be spent on personal tax credits this year. An area where the Chancellor's found that making savings can prove tricky, to say the least.
So the Chancellor faces some tricky trade-offs on Wednesday when he unveils his spending plans for the next 5 years. What should we expect him to do? Paul Johnson from the Institute of Fiscal Studies has some ideas. Paul, welcome back to the programme. Let's start with this tricky question of tax credits. What's the Chancellor, in your view, most likely to do?
Well, he's got two big choices here. One is that he can decide not to make any cuts, or very much in the way of cuts, next April. That's what all of the fuss has been about, the cuts that are going to come in next April, because actually most of the savings will come in any case in the long run, because he's also announced that the new universal credit system will be much less generous than he was originally intending. So by the time we get 5 or 10 years out, even if he doesn't put in place the cuts he was planning in April, he'll still be making much the same level of saving. But of course, if he does that, then his spending in 2016 on welfare benefits will be £4 billion or so higher than he was planning, and he will bust his own welfare cap, the cap that he's legislated, which assumes that he's going to make those make those savings. So that's one option. The other option is that he will try to find some savings in 2016, maybe reduce the cuts to tax credits, but have some savings there, and then look elsewhere in the welfare budget, perhaps to housing benefit, perhaps to child benefit, to make up the rest of those savings.
Well, if you look, whatever he does on tax credits is going to cost him money, certainly in the short run anyway. His deficit reduction plan for this year is already in some trouble. He faces huge pressures now to spend more on everything from health to security. Can he really still reach a surplus by 2020?
I think the first thing to say about that surplus in 2020 is that there's a huge amount of uncertainty about where we'll be. Forecasting these things 5 years out is an extremely tricky and uncertain business. But ignoring that, assuming that the whole world moves as he expects over the next few years, then he will require cuts of about 25% in those unprotected departments that we've just heard about, the Home Office, local government and so on top of the cuts that happened over the last Parliament, which will involve really substantial cuts of the order of 40 or 50% between 2010 and 2020. Those are really, really big changes to the way that we'll be delivering local government, to the way that we'll be delivering police force, the way that we'll be delivering further education and so on. So those unprotected areas of government will change fundamentally over the decade.
Well, let me just get this right, because I've seen these figures too, that when you add up all the cuts, those made, those about to happen, between 2010 and 2020, major departments, the unprotected ones, will face cuts of up to 40%. Is that doable?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Two things here. One is that it may not turn out that badly if, for example, the economy does better than expected, or the Chancellor finds some additional savings in social security, or he doesn't aim quite for that 10 billion surplus, he just goes for a 1 billion surplus. That can actually help quite a lot. But if he does go down that route, it's going to be difficult, and it'll be more difficult than it was over the last Parliament. For one thing, clearly, if there were relatively easy cuts to make, they will have been made already. And secondly, don't forget that one of the very biggest bits of public spending goes on the pay of people who work in the public sector, the pay of nurses and doctors and teachers and civil servants and so on. And actually that was quite easy to hold down over the last Parliament because pay in the private sector was doing so very badly. We expect, or most economists now expect, that pay in the private sector will start to rise relatively strongly. In that world, it's going to be quite hard to hold down pay right across the public sector, as he said he would do back in the July budget.
Paul Johnson, thanks for that.
Thank you.
I've been getting